As in corporeal distempers, a total loss of appetite, which no medicines can restore, forebodes certain decay and death, so, in the spiritual life of the soul, a neglect or disrelish of pious reading and instruction is a most fatal symptom. What hopes can we entertain of a person to whom the science of virtue and of eternal salvation doth not seem interesting or worth his application? It is impossible, says Saint Chrysostom, that a man should be saved who neglects assiduous pious reading or consideration. Handy craftsmen will rather suffer hunger and all other hardships than lose the instruments of their trade, knowing them to be the means of their subsistence. No less criminal and dangerous is the disposition of those who misspend their precious moments in reading romances and playbooks, which fill the mind with a worldly spirit, with a love of vanity, pleasure, idleness, and trifling, which destroy and lay waste all the generous sentiments of virtue in the heart, and sow there the seeds of every vice, which extend their baneful roots over the whole soil. Who seeks nourishment from poisons? What food is to the body, our thoughts and reflections are to the mind. By them the affections of the soul are nourished. The chameleon changes its color as it is affected by sadness, anger, or joy, or by the color upon which it sits, and we see an insect borrow its luster and hue from the plant or leaf upon which it feeds. In like manner, what our meditations and affections are, such will our souls become, either holy and spiritual or earthly and carnal. By pious reading, the mind is instructed and enlightened, and the affections of the heart are purified and inflamed. It is recommended by St. Paul as the summary of spiritual advice. Devout persons never want a spur to assiduous reading or meditation. They are insatiable in this exercise, and according to the golden motto of Thomas à Kempis, they find their chief delight in a closet with a good book. Worldly and tepid Christians stand certainly in the utmost need of this help to virtue. The world is a whirlpool of business, pleasure, and sin. Its torrent is always beating upon their hearts, ready to break in and bury them under its flood, unless frequent pious reading and consideration oppose a strong fence to its waves. The more deeply a person is immersed in its tumultuous cares, so much the greater ought to be his solicitude to find leisure to breathe after the fatigues and dissipation of business and company, to plunge his heart by secret prayer in the ocean of the divine immensity, and by pious reading to afford his soul some spiritual reflection, as the wearied husbandman, returning from his labor, recruits his spent vigor and exhausted strength by allowing his body necessary refreshment and repose. The lives of the saints furnish the Christian with a daily spiritual entertainment, which is not less agreeable than affecting and instructive, for in sacred biography the advantages of devotion and piety are joined with the most attractive charms of history. The method of forming men to virtue by example is, of all others, the shortest, the most easy, and the best adapted to all circumstances and dispositions. Pride recoils at precepts, but example instructs without usurping the authoritative air of a master. For by example a man seems to advise and teach him. Self, it does its work unperceived, and therefore with less opposition from the passions which take not the alarm. Its influence is communicated with pleasure. Nor does virtue here appear barren and dry as in discourses, but animated and living, arrayed with all her charms, exerting all her powers, and secretly obviating the pretenses, and removing the difficulties which self-love never fails to raise. In the lives of the saints we see the most perfect maxims of the gospel reduced to practice, and the most heroic virtue. Made the object of our senses, clothed, as it were, with a body, and exhibited to view in its most attractive dress. Here, moreover, we are taught the means by which virtue is obtained, and learn the precipices and snares which we are to shun, and the blinds and byways in which many are bewildered and misled in its pursuit. The example of the servants of God points out to us the true path, and leads us, as it were, by the hand into it, sweetly inviting, and encouraging us to walk cheerfully in the steps of those who are gone before us. Neither is it a small advantage that, by reading the history of the saints, we are introduced into the acquaintance of the greatest personages who have ever adorned the world. The brightest ornaments of the church militant, and the shining stars and suns of the church triumphant, our future companions in eternal glory. Whilst we admire the wonders of grace and mercy which God hath displayed in their favor, we are strongly moved to praise His adorable goodness, and in their penitential lives, at holy maxims, we learn the sublime lessons of practical virtue, which their assiduous meditation on the divine word, the most consummate experience in their deserts, watchings, and commerce with heaven, and the lights of the Holy Ghost, their interior master, discovered to them. But it is superfluous to show from reason the eminent usefulness of the example and the history of the saints, which the utmost sacred authority recommends to us as one of the most powerful helps to virtue. It is the admonition of St. Paul that we remember our holy teachers, and that having the end of their conversation before our eyes, we imitate their faith. For our instruction, the Holy Ghost himself inspired the prophets to record the lives and actions of many illustrious saints in the Holy Scriptures. The Church could not, in a more solemn manner, recommend to us to have these great models often before our eyes than by inserting in her daily office an abstract of the lives of the martyrs and the saints, which constant sacred custom is derived from the primitive ages in which the histories of the martyrs were publicly read at the divine office in the assemblies of the faithful. On their annual festivals, this is testified of the acts of Saint Polycarp in the life of Saint Pionius, and by Saint Austin of those of SS Perpetua and Felicitas, etc. The Council of Africa, under Aurelius, Archbishop of Carthage, in 397 mentions the acts of the martyrs being allowed to be read in the church on their anniversary days. Saint Caesarius permitted persons that were sick and weak to hear the histories of the martyrs sitting when they were of an uncommon length, but complained that some who were healthful unreasonably took the same liberty. All great masters of a spiritual life exceedingly extol the advantages which accrue to souls from the devout reading of the lives of eminent saints. Witness Saint Nilus, Saint Chrysostom, and others. Many fathers have employed their pens in transmitting down to posterity the actions of holy men, and the histories of saints were the frequent entertainment and delight of all pious persons who ever found in them a most powerful means of their encouragement and advancement in virtue. As Saint Bonaventure writes of Saint Francis of Assisi, by the remembrance of the saints, as by the touch of glowing stones of fire, he was himself enkindled and converted into a divine flame. Saint Stephen of Grandmont read their lives every day, and often on his knees. The abbot of Saint Junian, Saint Antoninus, Saint Thomas, and other holy men are recorded to have read assiduously the lives of the saints, and by their example to have daily inflamed themselves with fervor in all virtues. Saint Boniface of Mentz sent over to England for books of the lives of the saints, and by reading the acts of the martyrs animated himself with the spirit of martyrdom. This great apostle of Germany, Saint Sigiran, and others always carried with them in their journeys the acts of the martyrs, that they might read them whenever they traveled. It is related of Saint Anastasius the martyr that whilst he read the conflicts and victories of the martyrs, he watered the book with his tears and prayed that he might suffer the like for Christ. And so much was he delighted with this exercise that he employed, and so much was he delighted with this exercise that he employed it all his leisure hours. Saint Teresa declares how much the love of virtue was kindled in her breast by reading, even when she was a child. Joseph Scaliger, a rigid Calvinist critic, writes as follows on the acts of certain primitive martyrs. The souls of pious persons are so strongly affected in reading them that they always lay down the book with regret. This everyone may experience in himself. I with truth aver that there is nothing in the whole history of the Church with which I am so much moved. When I read them, I seem no longer to possess myself. It would be very easy to compile a volume of the remarkable testimonies of eminent and holy men concerning this most powerful help to virtue. Help to virtue. And to produce many examples of sinners who have been converted by it to an heroic practice of piety. An heroic practice of piety. heroic practice of piety, St. Austin mentions two courtiers who were moved on the spot to forsake the world and became fervent monks by accidentally reading the life of St. Anthony. St. John Columbin, from a rich, covetous, and passionate nobleman, was changed into a saint by casually reading the life of Saint Mary of Egypt. The Duke of Joyeuse, Marshal of France, owed his perfect conversion to the reading of the life of Saint Francis Borgia, which his servant had one evening laid on the table. To these, the example of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and innumerable others might be added, though Dr. Palafox, the pious Bishop of Osma, in his preface to the 4th tome of the Letters of St. Teresa, relates that an eminent Lutheran minister at Bremen, famous for several works which he had printed against the Catholic Church, purchased the life of St. Teresa, written by herself with a view of attempting to confute it, but by attentively reading it over, was converted to Catholic faith, and from that time led a most edifying life. The example of Mr. Abraham Woodhead, and others were not less illustrious. But to appeal to our own experience, who is not awakened from his spiritual lethargy and confounded at his own cowardice when he considers the fervor and courage of the saints. Who is not awakened? Who is not awakened from his spiritual lethargy and confounded at his own cowardice when he considers the fervor and courage of the saints?